I'm Ken Rockwell. Let's take a look at a bunch of tips and tricks and features that I use on my Canon EOS R6 Mark II. There's a lot to cover here, a lot of tricks. Some are basic, some are pretty nifty. We'll get into those. And I should say, I go fast. I'm from New York. I'm sorry. I like to get it all out. You can make this video play more slowly if you find the gear icon in your player. Go to playback speed in there and set it to like 0.5 or 0.75. And honestly, I find my written guide at kenrockwell.com. And the link is in my description here. That'll let you get this all at your own pace. So I don't expect anyone to follow along with the rate I'm going. Just know these resources are here for you on my website. Okay, to keep this sucker charged, honestly, you can pull the battery out if you want, but you don't need to. I charge it in the camera. It comes with an external charger, which is quite nice of Canon to include, but I would only use that if I have a second battery. Essentially, you plug your USB-C into a USB-C port right here, and you're good to go. What's important to realize is if you've got some older USB-A sources with this connector on there, this cable won't work. You really need to use a USB-C source like... well, with a cable like this, it sources from USB-C. It only draws about 8 watts maximum power, so you can charge from any source. For instance, any cheap little battery pack like this will certainly work in the field. Since it only draws a maximum of about 8 watts to charge its battery, you don't have to worry about the maximum power of the charger. Some people don't realize even if you use a 100-watt charger, that means its maximum capacity is 100 watts. If it only needs to deliver 8 watts, the system communicates and it only draws 8 watts. So charge this from anything you like from USB-C. Everybody has their own choices. I personally like to use 2 cards, and I use 1 card as a backup so that everything gets recorded to 2 cards. Not so much because there's a problem with cards dying today, but mostly because I'm dumb enough that maybe sometimes I erase something that I don't really want erased. What I worry about is when I hit the delete button overactively and delete something I wanted to keep, I usually can find it on the original card. To set that up, record function folder set, and when it says record to multiple, it records to multiple. And that way it's recorded on both cards at once. The menu system, it should be fairly obvious when you play with it, but you can select around. When you hit menu here, the Q button will take you to the 7 main menus. Then once you're in any one of them, the top front dial will get you through the individual pages or can even scoot you through to the next system like that. You can use the rear button here to select things inside each menu. And likewise, you can use this rear top dial to get from major menu system to major menu system. I love the My Menu menu. I program what I usually use, like battery info. What have I got here? See, I get the percentage and how many shots I've made. We all have different preferences. I personally like to put battery info, lens aberration corrections, custom shooting mode. We'll cover that later, ISO speed settings. And this is all of my written review and written user guide at kenrockwell.com, and the links are in my description. So if you'd rather just read it, which I personally find a lot more helpful, you can find it there as well. To set these, you go down to Configure, and then you can pretty much figure it out on your own from there. It is a really handy thing to have. The exposure mode dial should be self-explanatory. I really like the C1, C2, and C3 modes, and we'll cover those a little bit too. The FV exposure mode, this is a new one. This one only came out with some of their most recent cameras. The FV mode, everything is usually auto. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO, those are automatically set. If you want to set either one of them manually, you can either just tap it and change the front dial, or you can use the rear dial. See that orange thing moving around? That's what you will change when you move the top front dial. Notice how it looks like a top front dial. So if I move the top front dial, you see that's changing. As I move the rear dial, it changes what it is that I will change when I turn the front dial. And again, when you play with the camera, it's pretty easy. What's interesting is if you want to set this back to automatic control by the camera, press the trash button. Boom, that one now went to auto. To get all of these things to go back to automatic selection, simply hold the trash can for a few moments, and they all go back to automatic selection. I love the FV mode because it's essentially the same as all the other modes, but I can select what I want straight from this mode if I need to go to manual on any of these options, and everything else follows suit. The only gotcha is, and the reason I don't usually use FV mode is that auto ISO minimum shutter speed. If you have it set either automatically or manually to get to less than a 60th of a second, it's ignored in FV mode, and I've never figured out why. I consider it a defect. The shutter speed will never go below a 60th in auto ISO unless you've exceeded the maximum ISO you have set. So for most of my landscape shots, I usually have it set down to about an 1/8 of a second for its slower shutter speed in auto ISO, and FV mode won't do that for me. But do try that mode, and that's what it does. It's very helpful, clever mode. Autofocus mode. Canon shooters should know, and there's a lot of ways to get to any one of these. You've got your choice of one shot or servo. Servo is continuous autofocus, where it tracks your subject. One shot is it just focuses once and locks. And AI focus is a clever mode that just figures out what the subject's doing and chooses the best of those other two modes. The AF boxes are in green when they lock in one shot mode. They're in blue as they track around subjects in servo mode. And they go gray if you're not in focus, which I can't recall ever seeing because it's always in focus. There's something really nice that I like. I have a way that I can set it, so while I'm looking through the Finder, I can move my thumb around on this to move the autofocus areas that I see in the Finder. It's so much more useful than having to click these dopey things around. The way you set that is we go to Menu, we go to Autofocus Settings, page 4, touch and drag AF settings. You want to set them this way. You want to set the first one to enable so the whole thing works. Touch and drag so you can touch it and drag it to move the AF area around. Positioning method is relative. That means you don't have to touch it in any particular spot. It'll just move from wherever the focus point is, regardless of where you touch the screen. The active touch area is set to right. That means this half of the screen is going to work. If you shoot with your other eye and want to use this side of the screen, again, choose that to your thing. Relative sensitivity, I leave it on 0. That controls, obviously, how sensitive it is to the motion of your thumb. What's nice is, in olden days, I would shoot in the all-area autofocus mode. So in other words, it would just figure out where the subject was, lock onto it, and it would go. And if it didn't pick it out properly, then I would have to go hit this button and select the manual autofocus area mode and assign one point to say my subject. I don't have to do that anymore. The reason I love the R6 Mark II so much is it usually is in the all-area F mode. So you see, it's just going to find something, just found something. But if it's not what I want, as soon as I touch this screen, with my eye in the Finder, I have now swapped it to the one area autofocus mode, and then it just tracks around with that one area. For eye detection, I don't know why anybody would want to change this to any other thing, but I go to eye detection, which is an AF page 1. Eye detection auto. What auto means is it picks the closest eye, which is what you're supposed to use for focusing. That's the natural way to show somebody in a portrait. The nearest eye. If you focus on the further away eye, it looks weird. So you could force it to choose right eye or left eye, leave it on auto. And likewise, I wouldn't disable it. It works marvelously the way it is. Subject detection, a new feature on this camera is subject to detect auto. Some other cameras, I don't think the Sony A9 Mark III even, their fanciest camera, has an auto mode. They expect me manually to select what kind of subject. You know, if I have to select what kind of subject manually, it's not really autofocus, is it? So I just leave it on auto. My R6 Mark II has worked flawlessly. If you want to get focus to track, you have to set the autofocus to servo AF. If you set the autofocus to one shot and shoot in a continuous shutter mode, the exposure will lock as well as the focus in one-shot autofocus mode. To adjust the servo tracking, that is a crazy one. I hadn't researched it recently because honestly, at the defaults, my cameras have always worked great. But in AF page 2, in older cameras, you would have to select a certain kind of subject. There's one for general, another for things that move quickly, and so forth. Now what's nice is it automatically adjusts the way that it tracks depending on the subject. What these two adjustments mean if you wanted to alter either one of them. And what's nice is they each have automatic setting modes, which the older models of the camera didn't. So I don't know that you'll ever need to change these. Tracking sensitivity talks about how closely the camera stays locked on to something that it thinks is moving. Specifically, if you have a guy running down a field in sports and there's other players running in front of him, if you set it to a stronger setting, it will tend to stay locked onto that subject longer and not go off to whatever is interrupting it in between you and the subject. If you set it to a less sticky setting, it'll be more likely to jump to something that jumps in the way. The reason you don't really want to play with this too much is you might think, oh yeah, I always want it to stay locked on, but then maybe it'll stay locked on to something that isn't even the subject anymore, and it's just tracking something it thought was a subject and it got it wrong. Likewise, the other option here, accelerate, decelerate tracking. Ever since autofocus was first invented, in the continuous mode, every system has been able to track something that was moving at a constant speed. If a runner is running towards you, race cars coming towards you, it'll track that extremely well, and it will predict where the car is going to be as it's firing successive shots because it's expecting it to keep a constant speed. In these cameras today, the rate at which it can change the speed that it thinks the subject is moving is what is selected by acceleration, deceleration tracking. In other words, if you set that to a higher setting, it'll change its tracking speed more quickly. But the gotcha is it might lose your subject more quickly as well. So again, I have not ever had to play with these, but that's what they do. If you want to get manual focus with the lens that doesn't have an auto manual switch, go back to page 1, focus mode, AF. Obviously, you can have this switch here, which controls it in this lens. But if I didn't have this, that's where you'd set it to manual focus. You can tap this button here to magnify what's going on, Personally, I like to hit this button, which I find much easier to set when I'm actually shooting. To change that, we go to Menu, Custom Page 3, Customize Buttons, and we go down to the Set button, and I choose Magnify. There's no manual focus instant override in the autofocus modes. The closest thing you can get on this camera is if you go into AF settings, AF page 6, where it says electronic full-time MF. If you turn that to on, what'll happen is only in one-shot autofocus mode, then you can turn the manual focus ring and it will change its focus. It won't pay any attention if you're in the servo autofocus mode. Focus bracketing. What's brilliant is this camera can take a bracketed set of shots at different focus points, and then if you set the appropriate menus, it'll actually stack them all, align them all if you've handheld, and give you a final image. To do that, you can find those settings in the camera page 6. Focus bracketing. You want to set focus bracketing, at least I like to set it at enable. The number of shots is a maximum number of shots. Focus increments, you can adjust this to taste. That's how far it changes the focus for each shot. Exposure smoothing, enabling it lets it make the exposures match each other as it goes along. Depth composite, that's important. Enable that. Now the camera will save an image composited from the multiple bracketed shots. And to crop the depth, the reason you want to enable it is if you're hand holding or if your lens has a lot of focus breathing, each shot will cover a different area because as you're moving around, you're losing some corners on some shots. By enabling that, the final result will be just cropped in and just have what's relevant. Canon suggests a tripod, but I haven't needed one, and honestly, I can even use my 180mm macro lens, and it works great. You also can do it in a computer if you want to stack them in a computer. Again, see my written review for that, please. The multifunction button is really handy. It's this one here. You can set it as you want it. Each time you press it, you get a different pair of options, which are set by the rear dial and the top front dial as it shows here. If you want to change what the multifunction button has as featured items to set, you can go to Menu, Custom Page 3, Customize Buttons, and then you can choose the multifunction button. When you set it to dial function, that's doing what it normally does. You can program it to do other things, which tends to lose the magic of the multifunction button. You can choose what that multifunction button will offer as functions, and you can even add or remove them. If you hit Info for detail settings, notice we have 10 settings. You can have up to 10 different settings here, and each of these, you rotate that to select the position you're going to program, and hit Set, then you can choose what it does. Cancel that. Right now, because these two items on the far right are turned off, you only see 8 items when you hit the multifunction button. You can add or subtract these to your heart's content. Customizing controls and buttons. I think we've been here a few times. For instance, I programmed this to be a menu button for me. Customize buttons. There you go. Long exposures are brilliant in Canon. They have something called the bulb timer, which you only can get to if you first set this to bulb. Then in Menu, on camera page 7, you have the bulb timer. You want to enable it, and then you can set it to however long you want, up to 100 hours, 99, 59, 59. And then every time you press the bulb, it'll count off that exact exposure time and give you what you want. To get live color RGB histograms through your Finder. It's not on by default. It should be, because color histograms are really important if you're shooting in color. For some reason, camera makers haven't realized that. Maybe because they don't shoot. They just design cameras. Anyway, camera page 9. Shooting info display. Histogram display. You got to set that to RGB. Default is just what they call brightness. That's only useful if you're shooting in black and white. Display size, I choose small. Otherwise, I think it takes up too much of the Finder. And again, this is all personal choice. To get the viewfinder display to rotate, when you rotate the camera, we go to camera page 9, shooting info display. VF vertical display on. To get 40 frames a second, you need to have the electronic shutter. To get to the electronic shutter, you have to first turn off the anti-flicker shooting, which is in camera page 3. You got to turn that off. Good. And then, and only then, can you go to page 7 and select the electronic shutter mode. If you don't have the anti-flickering turned off, in other words, if anti-flicker is activated, you won't be able to set this, and sometimes you'll get a message, sometimes you won't, telling you what to do to get to it. It's really difficult. Honestly, I don't ever have to fiddle with this more than once. I program it into the C1, C2, and C3 modes, so all these modes change at the same time. Specifically, I send this for landscapes, this usually for people and pets, and this for sports. So this is at 40 frames a second with the electronic shutter and anti-flicker turned off. This, for instance, is set with the mechanical shutter and anti-flicker reduction and everything else going on. Everything with the camera is totally separate. The way you set these is you first set up when you get your camera. Choose whatever mode you like. Set up your camera the way you like it, and then you store the settings into one of those positions. The way you do that is in Menu, and you go to the wrench, page 6, custom shooting mode, boop. Then you can register settings. One thing you can also do is when I first get my camera, I leave auto update to enable. And enable means that everything you change is saved into that setting. If you set it to disable, it won't save what you change. It's your choice. I find that when I get a new camera, I like to set it to enable, so as I'm fine-tuning everything, it's updating it. And then when I get it locked down the way I like it, then I may set it to disable so that it doesn't change. The only thing really important is if you totally repurpose one of these settings and you want to be able to get back to what you did, set this to disable so you can recall what the original setting was. To copy them back and forth to each other, simply set the dial to say C2, and then go back into your menu, and then you can register that, which is now set for C2. You could register it to C1 or C3, so you've copied it into C1 or C3. So typically, I set up my camera, all the things I set up, things like the whether or not I record my copyright into every photo's EXIF. I set that for C1, then I copied it into C2, then modified just the things that I need for my different situations like sports. There's a very clever new delete burst mode. If I shoot a burst and it's blazing away here, you can't see it at 40 frames a second, and I hit playback, then I hit erase, you see this new option here? Select erase scene including image, hit set, select OK, and now all those probably 300 shots that I just made holding the shutter down for a few seconds are all gone at once. That's a very efficient little trick. And it's sad because Sony's new E9 Mark III doesn't have this mode. They mucked it up so that there's a few more button presses, so it just doesn't work conveniently. You can also choose that the shutter is open or closed and you turn the power off. I like to have it closed to keep my crud off my sensor. But if you like to have it open, people argue as to whether or not they think one is safe or not. You set that at menu, at the wrench, page 5, shutter it, shut down. Easy peasy, whatever you like. And that's it. There's a lot of stuff to cover here. Feel free to slow down the video, or definitely go to my written page where it's all covered in great detail, and everything is covered there, as well as sample images and a review of the camera. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell and KenRockwell.com here on KenRockwell.tv.